let's go ahead and move on and keep it moving. We're already an hour in, and we've got the gentleman. And this will not disappoint. My next guest, this is another guy. You know, I've had a chance to get to know him, and he has a rich history. And I won't dare go into his and tell his history because I was already a little off with Fatima's, so I will be off with his. But I will tell you that Byron Fogan is what he would consider a grateful recovering alcoholic and a compulsive gambler. He took his last drink about 7 years ago, and he spends his time today working on his own recovery and sharing his experience with others who seek to find a solution to their problems with addiction. Byron was a practicing attorney and public relations consultant for a number of years in Washington, D.C. His own personal plunge into the depths of substance abuse and the process of cleaning it all up took him to some dark and unfriendly places, including suspension from the practice of law and a short stay in federal prison. But that history of fall and recovery has blessed him by pointing him in this new direction. A life where he helps and advocates for returning citizens and those struggling with addiction. I want to welcome Byron. So, Byron, your story. When I think about your story, yours is more about this self-inflicting wound that you gave yourself, and so when it's like that, when the trauma and the pain that we suffer in our life is sort of self-inflicting, it can take on a different meaning, and there's this different process of growth and healing for us. So I want to talk about the guilt that you may or may not have felt, but does guilt become an obstacle in your recovery, especially for someone with a substance abuse issue? And if guilt was, if that was an obstacle for you, how did you address it?
So, number one, thank you. I'm happy to have this opportunity. It's so great to be with you. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. And, the way I look at my life, I had a series of shame-based social choices that came long before I got into recovery, right? Like the story of addiction is kind of a series of shame-based social choices, right? Like when I first started drinking and I first started using, I thought it was fun, right? Nobody around me used the way I did. Nobody around me drank the way I did. I thought it was fun. Until I started to recognize how different and how abnormal it was from my peers. And then you just start hiding. So you're talking about guilt and shame. Like the guilt and shame started long before the actual problem started, right? Mm-hmm. The guilt and shame started that first time I had a blackout and didn't really know what I did. The guilt and shame started the first time I lied to my parents about what I was doing, or had to break up with a girlfriend in high school because if I stuck around her too long, she'd know I drank like a pig. Right? And then started choosing, instead of to be around healthy people, started choosing to be around people who were equally as unhealthy as I was. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It started long before I ever found anything that even resembled recovery, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the guilt and shame of the previous night. It's the guilt and shame of the hangover. It's the guilt and shame of the promises unkept. The guilt and shame of the lies. The guilt and shame of kind of the degrading situations you put yourself in. And
it's really on a daily basis, then.
Daily basis.
Yeah.
It's I talk about towards the end of my drinking, like every day I woke up and said I wouldn't do it. And by noon or 2 o'clock, I was already drunk or already high or already gambling. And that was, I drank and used that way for 27 years.
So I know this wasn't a question that I had for you that I, pre-approved, but I wanted to ask you, do you, or would you want to share with us what you feel was one of the root causes, or issues that the reason why you drank and abused alcohol the way that you did?
So I'm going to be careful because I really don't talk about I talk about the process of being in recovery, but I don't really talk about how.
Okay.
I understand addiction as a disease, right? And I understand it as a disease because I don't try to look at the causes and conditions of what made me an alcoholic, right?
Mhm.
I do some work on that, obviously, within the program of recovery, but believing that it's a disease, I like the effects produced by alcohol. And when I drank alcohol, I liked it. And then when I didn't drink about it, I obsessed about it, right?
Mhm.
My disease tells me I don't have a disease. All these different types of things that have to do with the disease process of addiction. But the reason I kept on using in spite of the problems is something I can absolutely talk about, because I kept using it in spite of the problems because I didn't like myself very much. I was super afraid that if you got to know who I was, that you wouldn't like me. That if you got to know who I was, you'd find out I was a fraud, like that I didn't deserve to go to law school, that I didn't deserve to go to a good college, that somehow I didn't deserve to be married. Like, I hated me so much. I was so scared that
Wow.
people were going to find out what I was inside. And
Wow.
built this whole edifice around me to make sure you never found that out.
And you were masking that with the drinking,
Right.
because you get to be someone else.
Other addiction, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want anybody to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why I continue to use in spite of the problems, which is an easier conversation to have than
Yeah.
the disease process of addiction.
Yeah. Of course. Of course. Okay. All right. So let's talk about that. When we talk about the phoenix rising, before the phoenix rises from the ashes, there's a burning. There's a crash and burn that happens. So what was that for you?
It got to a place where literally I couldn't wake up and leave my house without becoming law enforcement involved. I went from being a pretty well-respected attorney and a pretty well-respected lobbyist and public affairs official to someone who literally could not walk out of my house without coming into severe conflict with other human beings. I was anti-socially drunk almost all the time. And if I wasn't anti-socially drunk, I was angry that I wasn't anti-socially drunk, and I was running into conflict with others, right? I ran into conflict with my family. I ran into conflict with my job. I stopped showing up for things that I was supposed to show up for. Things like depositions that I was supposed to be taking. Things like appearances before federal magistrates that I was supposed to be doing on behalf of my clients. I found myself in a position where if I wasn't drinking and if I wasn't using, I was in conflict with other people. Then if I was drinking and I was using, I was in conflict with other people.
Yes.
And unfortunately, law enforcement found their way into my life quite often, even though I wasn't beating people up or anything like that.
Right.
I was a menace. I became a menace. And so during my spiral towards my bottom, I just kind of burned down every relationship that I had. Again, violence, it was because of absence. It was because I didn't want to be around people who would require me to be sober.
Yeah. 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 You weren't showing up for others. You weren't showing up for yourself.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And I stopped caring about myself. I was hopeful towards the end that I would just drink myself to death.
Yeah.
Because I was too scared to kill myself. I thought that would hurt.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
greatest hope was that one day I would just drink myself to death, and then that would be over, and I would stop hurting the people I cared about and stop hurting myself.
Because at that point, that was the only out that you could see for yourself.
That was the only out I saw. That was the only out that I saw.
So tell us, what was your Phoenix moment? So you crashed and burned, of course. You spent some time, small amount of time in federal prison. You came out.
Right.
You made some choices. So what is that? What was that for you? What was that defining moment for you?
So it's interesting because my defining moment, I got sober 2.5 years before I had to start facing the consequences of my life in recovery. Right.
Okay.
So I got sober, and a lot of people will talk about getting sober or getting clean, and all of a sudden everything gets better. What happened to me is that I got sober and everything got worse. And the reason it got worse is that for the first time in 27 years, I started paying attention to the wreckage that I caused around me. I had never paid attention to it, not once in my adult life. And I got sober, and suddenly my eyes were opened to the problems that I created for myself, the people I love, and for the community around me.
Yeah.
So my Phoenix moment was actually a couple of days into recovery. I was in a detox, and there finally was somebody who looked at me and said, you know, it doesn't have to be like this anymore. There was another man who showed up on time. He did everything I didn't do. He was a man's man. He showed up when he said he was going to show up. He was happy, and I was sad all the time. He could smile. He treated women appropriately. He did everything that I did not do. And he looked at me and he told me it didn't have to be that way anymore. And I just started a journey where I decided to just follow his lead. And I started following other people's lead who were like him, who had found recovery, found a God of their understanding, and started doing things differently. And my Phoenix moment rose me through the garbage of cleaning up the wreckage of my past. By the time I went to prison, it was almost like, hey, this is just another badge to put on my chest. That's part of me putting my past behind me. It wasn't, I didn't like it, but it wasn't something where I was like, oh my God. Blah, blah, blah. No, it was just another piece of me putting my past behind me.
So this was going to be another part of the process of you healing and of this learning all these lessons. This is just another step in that. So you do your time and you were able to come out.
Right.
And now tell us about the work you're doing in the world.
So it took me a long time, and one of the previous ladies who spoke talked about like it taking a long time to talk about it. I think it was Demi. It took me a long time to be able to acknowledge to the world that I had been disbarred and I was in prison. It was not something that I could do easily. It certainly wasn't supposed to be part of my narrative, but it was. And once I started talking about it, I found I couldn't shut up. A lot of people who I expected a lot of people to look down on me and to denigrate my experience, and I didn't want that. Instead, what I found is a lot of people who were interested, they were curious, they were going through their own struggle and addiction. They went through their own struggle in incarceration, whether it be 24 hours like you described, or whether it be a much period of time. And we are hiding. We were all hiding. And it wasn't helping any of us. So I decided that the strength of my story is to be able to share it, that it does me no good to keep my story inside, but to share it with others in the hope that, number one, it's going to keep me clear, keep me honest, keep open about my process and how God has blessed me, but also as an aside, not as the primary purpose, but as an aside, help another person. Help another person understand the same thing that man once told me, which was, whatever you're going through, it doesn't have to be that way anymore, and it can start today. You don't have to wait 4 weeks in order to start your recovery. You don't have to wait 4 years to start your recovery. You don't have to get to prison to start your recovery. You can start your recovery right now. We can start together with one another.
So now you're showing up. You're
Right.
showing up.
I'm on time. I showed up for you on time.
That's awesome.
That's everything.
So tell us about the the work that you're doing, the organization and the people that you work with.
So I started an organization called FIRM, which is formerly Incarcerating and Recovering Men. And one of the things that I try to do is talk to men who are coming out of prison or who have been out of prison and who have felt like they've lost their way. Try to start developing some kind of training or some kind of relationship building between one another so that we can point each other into jobs, or we can help each other kind of form entrepreneurial guilds, like the old style guilds where we are supporting one another and helping each other get the message out about their businesses. And really just acting as a sounding board for one another. You know, there's a choice that you can make when you get incarcerated. There's a choice. You get to either continue to live life the way you used to, or you can change, right? And all the men that I work with and I speak with, we all made a decision long before we got out of prison that we were going to change. We didn't want to go back to what we were doing before, but some of us don't know how to achieve that. So together we discover how to achieve that. I also have, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's beautiful. I love that. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I also have a platform under which I share my story in recovery. And the biggest thing that I focus on is that recovery is fun, right? I don't talk about how I got recovery. There's a lot of different ways to find recovery. I found one. I found a God of my understanding who loves me and wants good things for me. That's great. But the emphasis for sober shit is like recovery is fun. Recovery is great.
Yeah.
Like I thought before I quit drinking and ripping and running that life was going to be miserable. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. My life is so much more fun today. I do things I never would have expected. I started motorcycles again, like at 43 years old. And now I can get off of them, right? Like I have fun. I have relationships. I have friendships with men, which was something I didn't do. I didn't trust guys.
Right.
I have friendships with people like you. I also meet people because I'm painfully introverted. So like life is just awesome. And I try to talk about that and share those stories either through writing or through posts. And I have a consultancy where I try to help attorneys who may find themselves in the kinds of problems I found myself in. And hopefully we can get to them before they start screwing up their life and mitigate the risks of addiction to their practice.
You know what I hear, Byron? I hear a man that now loves himself. Before, there was this part of you that you didn't like.
Right.
And now you have embraced you, love you for who you are. And a part of that too, I think, is because you're now serving others. And that's how we can find real fulfillment in life, is when we start to serve others. We start to pour into other people. And this work in particular, especially with those that have been incarcerated, is so important because you come out as a felon and you are rejected in a lot of different ways. It is so difficult. Starting a business is a great, a lot of them do. They have to start their own business to make their own way. And so they need that support. But also just for them coming out of a community of being incarcerated where you're supposed to be for rehabilitation, but it's really not. It's a system and it's a place that will break a man.
Right.
And he comes out even more broken. Right. And so you are offering this safe space for them to come and be whole again. And so I love that. And I'm proud of you. That's great. That's great.
You. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So thank you so much for agreeing to come on and share your story with us. And if you could, in the chat, you know, share your organization, the acronym again, and where they can find you in case there's someone out there who, you know, has someone that they want